Hey everybody, welcome to the SimHanger. My name is Mark, and we'll get started by trying to answer a question that may have been on your mind. For random access memory, the recommended is 32 gigabytes for Microsoft Flight Simulator 2024, and the ideal spec is a staggering 64 gigabytes of memory. During a recent development update, Sebastian from Osobo said you don't need 64 gigabyte. 32 is all you'll need for the sim. The ideal spec takes into account those that want to do multitasking activities such as recording and so on. So in this video I'm going to put it to the test using Microsoft Flight Simulator 2020. I've tested it out in 2D on the monitor and in 3D in virtual reality as well. The results, as always, will be indicative and system dependent. And of course, once Microsoft Flight Simulator 2024 is out, I will do a comparison test, but at this stage I anticipate the results to be very much the same, based on the technical details we've had access to so far. The upcoming flight sim was not my major motivation for upgrading, however. Being a content creator and video editor, it has other benefits. I'm using DDR5 memory. My 32 gigabytes was from Team Force. Rated at 7,200 MHz, however, I downclocked that to 6,800 for stability purposes. I've obviously remained with DDR5 memory. This time it's from Corsair, rated at 6,400 MHz, and I'm running it at that. My test conditions are the same as always. The G36 has 2 G1000 units, photogrammetry over Chicago, high-density scenery, and lots of water and reflections provide, I believe, a common and day-to-day environment. To record performance, I'm using MSI's Afterburner, link in the notes below. Under the GPU, I'm measuring the temperature, percentage utilization, and the overall power draw in watts, memory being used in megabytes, CPU temperature, and total core utilization, RAM or random access memory utilization, once again in megabytes, the current FPS, and the second figure is the 1% lows. If you're not sure what that is, you can look it up. And last but not least, of course, is the average FPS or frames per second during the whole test. We'll start with our test on the monitor first of all. I'm using an Asus ROG monitor 48-inch running at 120 Hz. The tests are done using the default Ultra settings at 4K, DX12 obviously, to allow for a direct like-for-like comparison with Flight Sim 24. Anti-aliasing mode is TAA, VSync is off, as this is designed primarily as a stress test. I'm going to run the test first and then comment as appropriate afterwards.
Five hundred. 500.
Taking a look at the overall results, a number of issues can be discounted. Firstly, you'll notice that the GPU was running a little bit hotter on the 64GB test. However, the PC had been running for longer and the GPU temperatures remained within acceptable parameters. The 32GB test recorded slightly higher FPS, but once again, that's not relevant or significant. Firstly, it falls within the 5% margin of error. Plus, initially I probably sat on the ground for a longer period during that test and therefore the FPS built up, so the starting position was higher. No two tests, of course, are exactly the same. There could be a variance in terms of the cloud coverage. Even though I'm using a preset scattered clouds, it can vary from one flight to the next. Plus, I'm recording and I'm also using flight control replay. All these factors combined means that the FPS difference is negligible. CPU utilization was pretty static throughout on both tests, as one would expect. The only significant difference was the RAM usage, jumping up from an average of 16GB on the 32GB test to 19GB. However, the really important aspect here is the smoothness of the flight and the absence or infrequency of stutters, etc. And both the 32GB and 64GB tests, well, they felt exactly the same. And I cannot say I could detect any discernible difference between the two, and I think this is highlighted to some degree by the 1% lows. Perhaps one important point I should have mentioned earlier, for each test I started with a clean rolling cache. So in summary, I think I would say that Sebastian was right. Microsoft Flight Simulator does not really benefit from 64GB of memory, and 32GB remains the sweet spot as far as I can ascertain. If I've missed something or your experience is different, let me know in the comments below. I'm no expert. Let's now turn to our test in virtual reality. I'm using the Pimax Crystal Light for this test, one of my favorite headsets for flight simulation. The resolution under Customize is set to 1, so I'm using the 2880 by 2880 pixels per eye, running at 90 Hz. Smart smoothing, fixed foveated rendering, and etc. are all off. Once again, designed to be a stress test. My VR settings are not ultra, they're the normal settings that I use day to day for virtual reality. That applies to both the Pimax Crystal Light, and the Quest 3. Also make it easier for me to judge any variances, as these are the settings I'm used to.
500. 500.
My comments on the 2D or monitor tests apply equally to the VR test. That applies to the GPU temperatures, RAM usage and average FPS overall, so I won't cover them again here. I think for these tests we have to discount the 1% lows. I'm not sure exactly what happened there, but they were not recording initially. As per the 2D test, I started with an empty rolling cache for each of the tests. Once again, the most important aspect is how smooth did it feel, and I have to say, in all honesty, there was no discernible difference that I could detect. Both had one or two micro stutters, but nothing significant. So based on the figures above and my experiences, I could see no discernible improvement for the 64GB memory upgrade compared to the 32GB option. And it'll be interesting when Microsoft Flight Simulator 2024 is out to do comparative tests, although I do suspect results are going to be very much the same. Of course, these results could be improved based on settings, use of DLSS, etc., but this was designed as a stress test. So if you were wondering overall, should you fork out for another 32 gigs of memory perhaps? Well, based on these test results, my recommendation would be no. It doesn't reflect any meaningful bang for your buck at this time. And once again, as mentioned earlier, we'll give it a full test once Microsoft Flight Simulator 2024 is out in the wild. Well, I hope you found this useful and informative. It's normal at this stage for me to say see you again soon, but that may not be the case. I'm going to be taking a short break in terms of content creation. I've got one video in the works which shows you all my rigs and all the hardware that I use, which will probably be out, I would imagine, late next week. I've also got my hands on the Honeycomb Charlie rudder pedals review coming soon. If you enjoyed the video, don't forget to give it a thumbs up. Take care, look after yourselves. Ciao for now.